So let's get started because I want to start with the intros and sort of introduce the general layout first for a second. So to everybody who's on here, welcome. This panel is being sponsored by the international section of AAEA, and also we're running it out of OSU's Department of Agricultural Development and Agricultural, Environmental, and Development Economics. And basically, we're going to spend the first 30 minutes with these panelists from 10 different organizations, or 10 to 9-ish organizations, talking about themselves and their research and their organization. And then we're going to do some questions that we got from students in advance. And then we'll open up the last 30 minutes for questions. But if you have a question at any point, you can feel free to put it in the chat. We'll sort of queue them up, like I'll be putting them into a document and make sure I have them all. And so, feel free to chat your question. Maybe we'll have certain people sort of unmute them and have them ask it personally in the last 30 minutes if that seems to be working okay. Otherwise, we'll read your question out loud. So that is what to do. If you have a question that you want answered, put it in the chat. We will not get to it immediately. We'll get to it in the last 30 minutes. All right, and this video is being recorded and will afterwards be posted to the same website that is on my webpage where we had the registration and the extra information. There's also some extra resources there on that page, and that will include a growing number of websites that might post job links outside of Joe. Like I think every organization here represented probably post a Joe, but they might also post other places. Some of the individual panelists have ideas of websites that they just know of. So go to that website, the panel on non-academic development economics research website, just to see like any other resources that we've posted. Okay, let us start with the introductions. Jeff.
Yeah, okay, hi, my name is Jeff Bloom. I work as a research economist at the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Economic Research Service, and specifically with the International Trade and Development Branch. The ERS provides technical and analytical support to the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the U.S. government more broadly on issues relating to agricultural production, both within the U.S. and around the world. There are 3 research branches within, or I guess research divisions to be more specific, within the ERS: food economics, markets and trade. That's where my branch is, and where the development people tend to sit, and then the resource and rural economies division. I'm a development economist, and I have research applications in agriculture and conflict and psychology. I started at the ERS in June and have primarily focused for the last several months on finishing up research projects that I started while I was completing my PhD. So that's sort of a nice benefit of working at the ERS. They let you sort of finish up projects before you kind of get started with ERS specific projects. But in general, I have a lot of flexibility about what I research. However, I always sort of need to try to motivate what I'm working on in some way, being some way related to agricultural production or rural development or food security in some ways. Yeah.
All right, next person.
Hi, I'm Uttara Balakrishnan. I work as a research economist at Impact International. Impact is a public policy research firm. We have work in the domestic health, education, and workforce development side within the US, but I work in the international development division. Our work broadly falls under 2 buckets. We do a lot of evaluation work and MEL support, so monitoring, evaluation, and learning support for various implementers, and we also do technical assistance. Our evaluation work is our main sort of portfolio. We do evaluations in a whole host of sectors: energy, agriculture, education, health, nutrition. And we also work in a lot of different countries. I've been at Impact for 2 years since I finished my PhD. I've worked primarily in our evaluation side of the portfolio. So I do work in our education evaluations, which include food for education funded projects in different countries. I also work on evaluations in the energy and agriculture sectors. Since working at Impact, it's been sort of a continuation of the type of research that I did during my PhD. I specialized in maternal and child nutrition and human capital in different countries while I was working on my dissertation, and that sort of continued during my time at Impact. In terms of what a typical day would look like at Impact, it sort of really varies. It could be, I think no 2 days look similar. It could be, some days could be just about doing research on a particular project and doing the work that that entails, but some days could be about writing grants or writing proposals to win new work. And so I think every day at Impact really varies in terms of the type of work that you would be doing.
Thanks, United.
Yes, so my name is Jonathan Flatnes. I'm a senior researcher at the Christian Michelsen Institute in Bergen, Norway. And CMI is an independent development interdisciplinary research institute. For those of you who don't know where Bergen is, it's second largest city in Norway and also called the Seattle of Scandinavia. So the mission of CMI is to address global challenges, development challenges facing by providing research-based knowledge that informs and inspires practice and policy. We have a particular focus on challenges facing poor and vulnerable groups in the global south. And the primary audience are national and international actors who influence international development. In terms of areas, we focus on corruption, gender, global health, governance, humanitarianism, natural resources, poverty, rights, tax and public finance. And I kind of fall somewhere in the area of poverty and natural resources. In terms of the work, I would say that 50% of the work is focused on publishing and 50% is sort of focused on acquiring funding. And there's strong incentive mechanisms that encourage publications. In terms of my own work, I have originally been working in the areas of microfinance and insurance in agricultural areas, but I was hired by CMI to build up their climate adaptation research area. So I'm planning some new projects around climate change and conflict, looking at adoption of climate smart technologies and so forth. In terms of kind of the division of time of the work that I do, I would say about 50% would be data analysis, writing papers for publication, 30% focused on grant writing, 10% field work, and 10% project management, admin type of work. There's relatively few internal reports as most of the work is focused on publications.
Hi everyone, my name is Soumya Balasubramanya. I work for the International Water Management Institute, which is part of the CGIAR, which probably many of you have heard about. I've been with IME, as it's called in its acronym form, for the past almost 10 years now. And so I did start my career at IME, and I've been there since. At the moment, I'm a senior researcher in environment and development economics, and I also lead the research group in economics and impact evaluation at IME. IME is, as I said, it's part of the CGIAR. Our mission is to do research to manage land and water for food security, for people's livelihoods, for poverty alleviation, and for environmental protection. So in terms of the kind of research that happens in economics at IME, it spans the disciplines of agricultural economics, development economics, environmental economics, and natural resource economics. So there's a lot of work that sits at the interface of that, and that's sort of what we do. A large chunk of my personal research sits in that portfolio. I work on different types of problems, be it water and health, it could be water, energy, food, it might be agriculture, water management, water and poverty, water and growth. And what we really do is do this research, of course, a big emphasis on publication and putting things out there, but it's also research for policy. And so we work very closely with both donors and recipients to inform policy and practice. And a lot of our work is very much taken up and implemented in policy and practice. IME is headquartered in Sri Lanka, but we have offices globally across Asia and Africa and in the US. And of course, we work very closely with other CGIAR organizations, and some of my colleagues are on the staff out here. In terms of time, if you're early career and you're going to be joining the CGIAR, you would be expected to spend most of your time writing, analyzing data, building your portfolio as a researcher. You wouldn't have to worry so much about writing grants, and you certainly wouldn't have to worry about writing internal reports. It changes though as you kind of go up the pecking order.
Hi everyone, my name is Will Thompson. I'm an economist at ID Insight in New Delhi, India. ID Insight is a research organization that tries to use rigorous data and evidence to help policymakers in the social sector optimize their social impact. We work across a broad geography. We have current permanent regional hubs in Dakar, Lusaka, Nairobi, and Manila, and also several smaller satellite offices that support specific initiatives. We're sector agnostic. We work in agriculture, education, health, nutrition, so across sectors. We're also client agnostic. We work with governments, foundations, NGOs, development banks. Our primary criteria really is at any engagement, just have the opportunity to have positive social impact. We also are, we use a variety of tools. I think that we kind of made a reputation early on with what we used to call decision-focused evaluations, or these fast, rapid RCTs that were focused on specific programmatic decisions for a development partner. But these days, we're equally likely to use process evaluations, formal qualitative work, theory of change consulting, set up M&E systems, just kind of whatever it takes to bring evidence to bear in a particular engagement. A lot of times we bundle several of these into a single long-term open-ended client engagement that we call a learning partnership. So that's a little bit about what ID Insight does. As I mentioned, I've been here since 2018 in the Delhi office. I've worked in a variety of sectors on several of these kind of engagements that I mentioned. My training is mainly in agriculture. My background is in impact evaluation. And my specific role within these engagements is to work as a tech team point person. So a normal project team will be composed of a client-facing manager, at least one associate, and a tech team point person whose job is to ensure the technical rigor of all the project deliverables. So depending on where a project is in its life cycle, I'll be doing inception work. So experimental design, impact evaluation design, theory of change consulting, sampling. When it gets more advanced, I'll support on other aspects, writing the code to do the analysis, reviewing code to do analysis, working on client deliverables. I'd say about 75% of my time overall is spent on project work. The remainder is mainly spent on supporting intra-office professional development, training up our associates, working on grant proposals and various internal reports and documents. So yeah, that's ID Insight.
Thanks. Agnes, you're next.
Hi, Leah. Thanks for organizing this panel. It's nice to see old friends and former colleagues here. My name is Agnes Kisumbing. I work for the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI, which is based in Washington, D.C. Its vision is a world free of hunger and malnutrition, and its mission is to provide, I got this from the website, research-based policy solutions that sustainably reduce poverty and end hunger and malnutrition. So we're also a member of the CGIAR, like Somya and Imi. We have about 600 employees in more than 50 countries. It's probably the CGIAR center which has the most social scientists. IFPRI has many economists. It has 4 research divisions, the Poverty, Health, and Nutrition Division, where I belong, which also has a very big complement of nutritionists. The Environment and Production Technology Division, which has production people, very aggy. Environment types, people who work on irrigation, climate change, GIS types. We have the Markets, Trade, and Institutions Division. You have a lot of macro modelers there, but also people working on contracts, markets, a lot of impact evaluations too. And the Development Strategy and Governance Division, which hosts most of IFPRI's country programs. The country programs provide policy research support in country. So I've been at IFPRI, believe it or not, for 25 years. And in my career at IFPRI, I've worked on gender and inter-household allocation, poverty dynamics, assets and poverty traps, measurement of women's empowerment. I'm now engaged in impact evaluations of agriculture and nutrition programs. And I also manage quite a large team. So I'm the theme leader of the gender cross-cutting theme at IFPRI. So IFPRI is a nice place for a non-academic career. As you can see, I've stuck around for 25 years. I don't have tenure, but 25 years is almost like tenure. People who with PhDs typically join as associate research fellows and then work their way up. That said, we also have research assistants. Our many people who join IFPRI as RAs find it a very good jumping off point for pursuing for going back to graduate school. And I think one thing I'll say about IFPRI is that it's a really nice and collegial environment. I think my IFPRI colleagues here will agree with that. Um, we like to work in teams, we look out for each other, and it's been a really nice place for me to grow professionally and also to grow my family. I have 2 children who are teenagers and 20 years also, not teenagers anymore. That's all.
Thank you. Esteban.
Thanks, Leah. My name is Esteban Quiñones, and I'm a researcher at Mathematica. So I just finished my PhD a year and a half ago and joined Mathematica as a researcher in their international division. So Mathematica is a policy research institution, and our mission is to improve public well-being. We collaborate closely with clients of many different stripes to improve their programs, refine strategies, and understand our overall understanding of the world. We have expertise in data, methods, policy, practice, and our goal is always to translate those, let's say, skills into insights that inform our clients' programs. So much like some of the institutions that have been described so far, we have a focus on being quite interdisciplinary. There are many economists, but certainly people from all sorts of walks, let's say, of disciplines. And we do a lot of mixed methods work in addition to probably what we're better known for in terms of quantitative rigorous evaluations. So there are roughly 1,400 employees at Mathematica. We have offices in Chicago, where I'm based, as well as Seattle, Oakland, Washington, DC, Cambridge, and our headquarters is in Princeton, New Jersey. There are other offices, but those are the offices let's say, work with people most frequently that are in our international division, where I'm situated. So we work on a wide variety of topics. In the international area, we're working on monitoring and evaluation learning frameworks, or more, let's say, deep and rigorous evaluations on health, child welfare, education, family support, nutrition, employment, many different things across the spectrum. I in particular am focused primarily on agriculture and food security at the moment, and that's an area, let's say, where our portfolio is expanding quickly. Mathematica is really best known for our domestic work in the US, having been part of the New Jersey negative income tax experiments over 50 years ago, and has moved into, say, the international space over the last 15 years. So one unique thing about Mathematica is that we are in an employee-owned organization, which is kind of a bit of a hybrid of most of the other types of organizations we'll hear about today. And I'd say probably 70% of my time is spent on project work. Currently, I'm working on evaluations of either irrigation or dairy interventions in, let's say, in Nigeria, in Niger, in India. And I'd say the rest of my time is spent either working with other colleagues on grant writing. Then I'd say that there's certainly always kind of a chunk of time available for making sure that whether you're making sure your Mathematica projects or your previous research continues to advance. So I'll stop there. so that I don't go way over time.
Thanks.
Okay, my turn. So I'm Mateusz Filipski. I am, as you can see here in the background, I'm an assistant professor at the University of Georgia, but before that I was at IFPRI, same as Agnes. So I worked at IFPRI for 5 years and I'm still engaged with IFPRI as a non-resident fellow. And so that's why I kind of, I get to be on the panel. I'm lucky because Agnes already presented IFPRI, so I can just add a couple of things to that. So IFPRI, is the International Food Policy Research Institute, and so I want to emphasize the words policy and the word research. Why policy? Well, because so that is really central to IFPRI's mission, right? We do policy relevant research, and IFPRI is an entirely soft-funded institution, and so any grants, et cetera, have to have policy relevance at their core. So ultimately, that's what drives all the work. And so why do I want to insist on research? Well, because IFPRI really does have at its core a commitment to high quality research. We do most of the research kind of from scratch. So we design surveys, we run surveys, we analyze the data, we publish in academic outlets, in addition to the reports we write for donors and stakeholders. And so importantly, researchers at IFPRI get promoted on the basis of their academic output. So it really is at the core of the contract you make with when you work with IFPRI that you will produce academic output. Now, some people, especially younger researchers, kind of complain that it gives slightly schizophrenic incentives because you need to balance the policy and the academic output. However, it kind of ensures that we maintain a commitment to academic excellence as much as possible. So as far as my work is concerned, I'm a development economist. Broadly speaking, I work on either impact evaluation of programs and policy, but also a big part of my work concerns modeling or uses modeling, particularly general equilibrium modeling. And that's important because I think that was a really big part of me getting a job at IFPRI. IFPRI has a lot of modelers among their team, and so that was part of what got me that job. In terms of what a typical day at IFPRI looks like, it's really hard to say. So I was a part of the development strategy and governance division. Like Agnes said earlier, that's a division that has lots of country offices. And so some of my days, would look like, I might be in Washington writing papers or running regressions, but also part of my days would be, some of my days would be somewhere out, in rural Ethiopia, riding a mule, trying to get to some remote village where we have to collect data. So it's, it's very hard to describe a typical day. But yeah, that's all I got.
Thanks.
Hi, my name's Jen Cisse. I'm currently an associate academic officer at the United Nations University Institute for Environment and Human Security. The UN University is an academic arm of the United Nations and basically functions as the United Nations think tank, but a lot of people don't know about it. The mission of the Institute for Environment and Human Security is to carry out cutting edge research on risks and adaptation related to environmental hazards and global change. And I actually wear a second hat within UNU EHS. I'm a senior research manager with the Munich Climate Insurance Initiative, which is a German NGO that is hosted by the United Nations University in Bonn, Germany. So MCII also functions as a think tank on climate change and insurance, focused on developing financial solutions for the risks posed by climate change for low income and vulnerable people in developing countries. So I'm going to mention briefly the types of things I work on at MCII and UNU EHS, and I'll also speak a little bit about my previous role at the Bureau for Food Security at USAID. So currently at MCII, I'm working on drafting an evidence roadmap for disaster risk finance. So that involves analyzing what the state of the evidence is, the academic evidence, also the implementer kind of lessons learned evidence that's available, and determining what are the gaps, and then trying to create a roadmap as a public good to motivate the global community to move forward on evidence for disaster risk finance. But at the same time, I kind of function as the monitoring and evaluation person at MCII, and also I manage a research consortium. So I don't end up doing a lot of field work myself, at least not on the research side, but I do get to design the research questions that we're interested in exploring and support the analysis and writing as well, although that's not my primary role. Before joining the United Nations University, I was a senior risk advisor at USAID's Bureau for Food Security, which leads the US government's multi-agency Feed the Future initiative, which is the government's global hunger and food security initiative. So in all of these different roles, I've kind of functioned as a technical expert, providing input on issues related to risk, resilience, and insurance, and disaster risk finance more generally. That means that I get to engage in policy conversations. I'm really glad that the previous speaker mentioned policy. All of these roles have really tried to focus on bringing academic and high quality research to bear on policy discussions and decisions. So I get to be engaged in policy conversations, provide input to implementers, and support project designs, implementation. MCII is also an implementer organization, and the management of those projects. The other side is also managing research. So particularly when I was at USAID, not only did I manage one of USAID's largest economic research grants, but I also got to write the request for applications for the next iteration of that. So it's really exciting because you get to determine what the priorities are and identify what type of research you think will be valuable for the policy world. I mean, USAID has an incredible amount of influence on the direction of development activities. So being able to identify and determine what research will get funded that will support those priorities is really exciting. So yeah, and currently I engage with research partners on kind of identifying where the needs are and directing research investments from the UNU perspective. So that's it for me.
Thanks. All right, last, Ishani.
Sorry, I was having some issues there moving my cursor. I'm Ishani Kanpal. I'm an economist in the World Bank's research department. The bank's mission is the eradication of poverty, and I work, broadly speaking, on this. More specifically, I work on studying the effects, particularly the unintended effects of development policy, things like social safety nets and investments in health systems. I'm also particularly interested in gender and understanding how pre-existing inequalities, whether they be driven by things like gender or ethnicity or caste, interact with development policy, and in particular where they lead to impacts on untargeted outcomes or untargeted populations. In terms of what my work life looks like, at least in non-COVID times, I spend about a third of my time doing internal consulting for the bank, making sure that the research that we do in our department is translating into at least policy advice. The remaining 2/3 of my time is for self-directed research. Often that is still, in my case, entirely informed by the internal consulting I do. So whether it's sort of taking data from an impact. So an example of the internal consulting might be an impact evaluation. And so then in my research, I might take data from that impact evaluation and use it to answer a slightly different question that goes beyond the impact evaluation. I should mention the research department is a relatively small part of the bank. It's unclear to me how many people know about it. So let me tell you a little bit more about the department itself. We're a group of 65 economists. There are 6 groups. So I'm in the poverty and inequality team. There's the human development team, which includes things like social protection, health, and gender. Between my team, the poverty and inequality team, and the human development team, there's a lot of overlap and a lot of sort of co-authorship as well between the researchers. Then there's the finance and private sector team. There's a macro team, a trade team, and the environment and ag team. You know, it sort of in some ways mirrors what Agnes described for IFPRI in terms of how the research department is organized. So what I do is you know, as I said, research on poverty, inequality, and broadly speaking, human development. In terms of the amount of time that I spend in the field, it's really sort of up to me. It's very much driven by what I have going on at the moment. I would say in general, I have a lot of flexibility. I try to have no more than one project in the field. I have a young child, and so I appreciate having the flexibility, a job that gives me the flexibility to do that. I spend most of my time on sort of research papers. I don't do a lot of internal report writing, other than sometimes writing, you know, up an impact evaluation that then I typically try to publish as well. And I'll leave it at that.
Awesome. Thank you guys all so much. That was really efficient, actually, and we pretty much ended in that 30 minutes. So great. So we have, for the people listening, we elicited some questions in advance, and so I'm going to go through sort of 3 sections of questions which I've pre-assigned to various panelists. So the first is on sort of life as a non-academic researcher as opposed to academic researcher. 2 of our panelists have actually done both of that, so they have sort of special insight in this. But I think a lot of people, you know, you do know something about academia from having done your PhD. So even the people who didn't technically work as professors in academia can probably speak to that. Then we're going to talk about career trajectories outside of academia, sort of, you know, as Agnes was saying, like there's not tenure, but what else do you do? What are the other options that you can go into? And then we're going to talk about like the process of applying to and getting an academic and non-academic research job. Then we'll open it up for other folks' questions. So again, if you have another question, put it in the chat, and we're queuing them up, like everybody who puts it in and pasting into this document and sort of saving them as they go. So the first question goes to Jen and Soumya, and it's what skills are sort of particularly important in your job, or in Jen's speaking to like 3 jobs here, so she can pick which job she's referring to, that are maybe like skills that would be really valued in your job that are a little different maybe than skills that are valued in academia. Or if it's the same skills, that's fine too.
Yeah, thanks, Leah. I think from both the USAID perspective and the United Nations, they're both highly collaborative work environments where you have to be working with a lot of people. So I know in academia, you may be co-authoring with a number of people, particularly depending on discipline, but you kind of get to choose who your friends are, I think, in some ways. Whereas in government or when working with the UN, you're in these teams and you have to really be able to influence how decisions are made. So I think that that's probably the main difference. Rather than getting to choose the type of research that interests you and try to apply for funding to be able to do that, it's more about using your influence to convince others that your research priorities are worth spending public money on. So I think that's probably the main difference. The other thing I'd say is I do a lot less field work and actual data analysis. When I was at USAID, I didn't even have Stata on my computer. It was very sad. But at the same time, we get to, really direct research, which can be exciting.
Yeah, to add to what Jen just said, and as my colleagues at IFPRI already said, you won't get promoted in the CGIAR unless you have those academic outputs, which are those papers. But that's not the only, so that remains important, but that's not the only thing. There are other things that we look for. And a lot of it, as we said, is very much about working with governments and influencing policy and practice. And in that front, I think some of the things that would be very useful is to have breadth, and also have depth. So the ability to be able to put in a lot of information into context pretty quickly, to be able to communicate complex, rigorous research in a manner that resonates with policymakers. to be able to communicate that research. So you might have a really neat paper, but then how do you communicate that to somebody who's not necessarily going to understand, different types of bootstrapping methods and why one works and why one doesn't work? And how do you sell that? And also the one thing that I would say is you really need to have the ability to switch between projects really quickly, because you will be working on multiple projects at the same time, much more than what you probably would be doing if you went on the academic tenure track job. And I think that often gets to people, and that's where things sort of are, I think, quite different than academia. And the other thing is, I should say that the gestation period on what we do is quite long. So it takes us a bit longer to get, at the end of the fourth year, you need to have X number of papers in academia. You may or may not have that in this framework. So.
Awesome, thanks. So if nobody wants to add on a thing to that, the next question is about sort of culture, particularly work-life balance, but other aspects of culture. You guys have kind of touched on that a little bit with the working together is a big part of the jobs. But to Matteo and Uniner, what do you have to say? Because these are our two panelists who have both worked as assistant professors and have also worked as researchers outside academia. So how would you, really in your personal life, compare the culture between the two institutes?
Yeah, so I would like to just second what Jen was saying on very collaborative nature. So I found that it's extremely collaborative. It's a little more hierarchical than in the academic world. We do have very specific research groups, and we're expected to come up with research ideas. There's a very good support structure around us, where you kind of come up with good research ideas, and then within your research group, you present those, you get feedback of those, and those usually turn into proposals for grant applications. In terms of work-life balance, I don't know if this is the difference between academia and non-academia, or just being in Norway, but Norway is certainly very centered on work-life balance. So it's certainly possible to work a lot if you really want here, but I think people really focus on trying to be efficient during the hours that they work during the day, and then perhaps take up early and spend time on other things. People really like to go to their cabins in Norway, so that's kind of a big thing here. Spending time outdoors, which is particularly common here in Bergen.
Okay, let me try to add to that. Well, first of all, I fully agree with Agnes that IFPRI is a wonderful place to work with a lot of wonderful people who are great to work with. In particular, people who work at IFPRI tend to be really good researchers, but at the same time, really value the mission of the organization, really value the policy mission. They tend to be people that are very down to earth, really enjoy being in the field. And in general, that makes, at least for me, it makes for a really nice atmosphere. In terms of work-life balance, I'd say it's really personal. Some people are very good at work-life balance. If you're one of these people, then IFPRI will work for you. It's very possible to achieve work-life balance at IFPRI. Compared to academia, I found that even though IFPRI does have the requirement of publishing in academic journals, in general, people are a lot less consumed with the publish or perish mentality than in kind of university academia. And so, particularly for someone who's straight out of their dissertation, hasn't yet published anything, that would be a lot less stressful because people are kind of pretty good at, seeing that there are bigger things in life than your revise and resubmit.
One thing I just add on the work-life balance, which is, and Jeff may have insight on this too, but if you're working for the US government, you do not get a ton of vacation. If you're working for the United Nations University, you get 30 days of vacation plus 2 weeks of time at Christmas, so.
Yeah, that's true.
All right, go on, Jeff, on the university, and then Soumya, yeah.
It's another part of working for a government job, and we can get this at the end, is your email is super locked down, so I can only access my USDA email on my laptop. So that's one thing that sort of helps provide sort of a barrier that helps work-life balance. So just adding that in.
Yeah, and just to say that the CG is quite good in terms of being quite generous with annual leave, in terms of having sick leave, in terms of having vacation time, flexible working hours, work from home. There's a lot of flexibility out there, and people work long hours, but there's also quite a bit of flexibility. And in that sense, the CGIAR is, I think, lots of people come, stay their careers really. And so I think there is the ability to really balance things if you really want to.
Awesome. Oh, Shani, do you want to add something to the World Bank? I think that's would be great.
Yeah, just really quickly. So the bank is really big and people have very different experiences. In my department, in the research department, we do have a lot of flexibility, which is wonderful. There are other parts of the bank where I think it's a little more rigid, but in general, the bank is also a very generous employer when it comes to leave. Well, generally a generous employer. But I did want to note that, as a development economist, especially if you're working in policy, you should expect to work odd hours every now and then, right? So we're all used to waking up, I think, at 6 in the morning and taking a phone call, or going to bed at like midnight because you took a phone call. That's part of the job, and I think we're sort of all here in part because of that interaction, and we enjoy that.
Thanks. That's actually a really great point. All right, so the last part of this sort of academia versus whatever is, I think these are really the two main things people ask about. Is they ask about sort of the lifestyle, and then the second thing is they ask, like, do you feel like you're making a bigger impact? Like, do you get more bang for your buck in terms of like really making change in the world as a outside academia person versus somebody who's more focused on publishing papers in an academic system? So that question was going to Shani and Will.
So the short answer is I don't know the counterfactual, but to sort of elaborate on that, I do think, so the bank has what we call convening power, and it is true that you get access even as a young researcher that you might not get in some parts of academia. In the work that I do, so I became a development economist sort of very much driven by personal preference. My mother and her siblings all experienced hunger. So, sort of I come from that background. And so it's very personal to me. So I wanted to do something that had an impact on people's lives. I try to make time to make sure that I'm not sort of getting caught up in this, in my R&Rs, or more recently, just a wave of rejections. That I try to engage with people in operations in the bank, and then whenever I have the ability to engage with policymakers as well, and they do listen. It is true that sort of in development, I think we've made this amazing move towards evidence-based policy, and I think that really sort of pays off in terms of how much access we have as researchers, whether in academia or in other organizations like the bank.
Well,
yeah, my response was the same. That it's very, very hard to know the counterfactual, or at least my quick response. But I think that I am, and I have a few reasons for that. The first is that the kind of engagements that ID Insight prioritizes, and as I mentioned earlier, our number one criteria is always the potential for social impact. So when we're deciding what grants to apply for, like which ones to accept, we're asking questions like, how likely we are to generate useful evidence. We consider scale. We consider stakeholders' willingness to apply evidence, whether it's positive, negative, like null, in their decision making. If a project doesn't pass on immediate impact, on an impact criteria, it really needs to have very high strategic value. And usually that strategic value for us is whether it puts us in a position to generate future work and future evidence that does have social impact. So first, and then, the ability to publish a result academically is important to us, but it's definitely not the first or even the second consideration. I think it's kind of evident in a lot of the engagements that we're currently pursuing. I mean, I said earlier that we're client agnostic, and we are, but I think that the kind of work that our revealed preference, at least where I work in India, is to do a lot of kind of state capacity building. A lot of our engagements are with government, and they potentially have impact at very, very broad scale. So a project that I personally work on is our aspirational districts program. Aspirational districts are the 100 odd poorest districts in India. They have a massive population. We directly work on 27 districts with a population of 60 million on these. And the goal of this program is to get Indian administrative service officers to give them high quality, high frequency data on a range of indicators and get them to use those to kind of set priorities. So yeah, I mean, just the potential for scale there is huge. And I think we, we sometimes wonder, it's kind of mixed. I think there's a long gestation period with these relationships, but I think that we hope with time and persistence and continuing to advocate for this kind of use of evidence at scale that will, eventually have like a large impact. So yeah, but again, hard to know the counterfactual. I also think that at ID Insight, we, I have to consider my personal counterfactual in academia. And I feel like where I am in academia or at ID Insight, we put good projects, we recruit well. I think that it would take, for me, to make the jump to academia and to feel like I'm having greater impact, like kind of on each of those dimensions on those resources, I would need to know that it's going to be at least as good. And that's just not always the case. I mean, some academic positions are easier than others to access those kinds of resources. So yeah, so answer is I think, I hope.
Thanks. Yeah, no, these are really hard questions for the people who haven't done both. Okay, so I'm going to say that we need to super pick up the answers to these because that was 1/3 of the questions I have and half of the time. So please attempt to be succinct in your answers to these questions. So when it comes to career trajectories outside of academia, Agnes and then Esteban, like what is the sort of markers that you expect in the career trajectory in your organizations, obviously?
Okay, so usually people who finish, who have PhDs get hired as associate research fellows. There was a question whether it is the same as a postdoc. It is the same as a postdoc. We call them ARFs, associate research fellows, because it's a more prestigious sounding thing when you're dealing with policymakers in developing countries who think that postdocs are lower on the rung. No, our associate research fellows are very well trained, young, usually individuals who are very capable. We're proud of them. So after, that's usually a 3-year period, 2 years or extendable to 3. And then you're considered for promotion to research fellow. And the promotions are usually contingent on publications, and yeah, you should have published something during your postdoc years. And then as research fellow, you get to manage projects, you start doing some fundraising, you supervise some people. When you really get sort of into the fundraising thing, you are considered for promotion to senior research fellow. And that is actually the highest rank that you have at IFPRI, unless you want to become a division director or a deputy division director. It's a pretty flat structure. I am a senior research fellow and I have been an SRF for 20 years. No, not 20. Yes, almost 20 years. So, so you can, of course, get additional responsibilities if you want by being part of the management team. But yeah, that's it. It's the flat structure is nice. I'm actually was a bit surprised by John Einar's comment that that he found the non-academic world a bit more hierarchical. I don't think of IFPRI as that hierarchical, but that might be because I've been there for a long time. So the younger people at IFPRI might not agree with me.
And of course, people should keep in mind that answers are going to really differ in these types of details across the different organizations. Will, did you have something you want to add to that? That was Will, right? No, sorry, Ishani. I apologize. Yeah.
Yes, sorry. So I actually just put my hand up when you said that. So you might have seen someone else out of the corner of your eye. But I wanted to agree with Agnes that I don't think of at least my part of the bank as being hierarchical at all. Both in terms of like individual papers, there are papers where I'm junior in terms of years at the bank, but I'm the person leading the analysis and the writing and whatever, and my senior co-authors are sort of very willing to kowtow to me, for lack of a better word. But I generally find it to be a very sort of collegial atmosphere. That said, we do have a relatively new tenure system. So I am on something like a tenure track. We have a midterm review 4 years after you're first hired, and then a review for promotion 4 years after that. So it's like an 8-year clock. At the end of that, you can be promoted to senior economist, or you're given a year to find something else. It is a little bit easier to do that if you're sort of in the bank already to make a transition. Someone was recently denied promotion and they're looking for something within the bank. So you're not sort of starting out from scratch necessarily. And then you can go up to lead economist, I think 10 years after you get promoted to senior. So we do have something like a tenure track, and it's very heavily focused on publications, mostly the quality, I would say, more than the quantity, but they do look at both.
If I could add briefly, at Mathematica, it's also, let's say, quite a flat structure, even more so, I guess, than some of the other organizations. So there's certainly, let's say, a starting point of coming in with a PhD as a researcher, with the expectation that as you take on more central and senior roles, and those could be both in a technical sense, so really being the technical lead on a project, versus being a bit more of the main manager of a project. And those are kind of two related but distinct tracks that can lead you into being a senior researcher over time. And we certainly, let's say, have an appreciation for publications, and we're encouraged to do that, but you in fact don't need to publish explicitly to advance within the organization. And so many people still do because of our interests, and it's certainly good for Mathematica, but that's a bit different and makes it, I think, even a little bit more of a, let's say, flat or less hierarchical structure. In the same vein, you don't necessarily have to have a PhD to become, let's say, a researcher at Mathematica. If you don't have one, but you're there and you prove yourself, you can move up to, what is typically thought of as like a senior staff level. And I think that's quite distinct and presents some opportunities. The last thing I want to mention is I've only been at Mathematica for 1.5 years, but as kind of evidence of this, I think, flat structure, I'm playing a role in helping set our new strategy, both for agriculture and food security, let's say, work, as well as we're opening a new practice on climate change. So we do a lot of climate work, but it's really just been integrated into other areas. And so we're starting a new area altogether, and that's another thing that I'll be contributing to. And so there are a lot of opportunities to shape, I think, what you work on and how you advance your career. And that's a flexibility that is certainly appreciated.
I just wanted to clarify that we at CMI are certainly not hierarchical. It was mostly just a comparison to academia, which I would consider to be the ultimately a flat organization. But we do have a director, and then we have research directors. So that sort of gives a little bit of a structure around what we do, but we're certainly free to work on pretty much whatever we want, as long as we can get funding for it. But it's certainly not hierarchical, compared to most other organizations. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Good clarification. And then, so I'm going to kind of skip this next question, but instead I'm just going to invite Uttara to talk about it at Impact, because people are already bringing in like how much you publish or don't publish and how that, relates to whether you're succeeding or not. So at Impact, what is the situation with publishing and like the markers for success?
I think it's similar to what Will said for ID Insights. So publications aren't the first thing that you're definitely encouraged to publish, but I think the markers for success are more how tailored you can make your the evaluation design, for instance, that you propose, tailored to the needs of the particular client, and same way when you write a proposal, how tailored can you make that to what the client is looking for and how applicable that is in that particular context. And so there are sort of formal markers for success in terms of quantifiable criteria, like how rigorous a research design that you propose is, but there's also softer skills that are required, like how collaborative can you be, how can you sort of integrate different types of disciplines within the design that you're proposing, and how you can work in teams as well.
Cool, thanks. Okay, so last, Will and Jeff, or if anybody else wants to chime in, do you feel like you have a route back to academia if you wanted to, and or like what would be the other sort of, if you were gonna leave, like where would you go? Like what's your outside option?
Yeah, so I'll take the second part first. I mean, I think if I were to leave ID Insight, I like the kind of organizations on this panel are the most likely candidates. But in addition to that, I would add development banks, foundations, NGOs. I think ID Insight, kind of by virtue of our focus on regional offices, like our centers of gravity are mostly in our country offices, like there's really a chance to build very deep regional and sectoral policy knowledge that would have value at any of those kinds of institutions. We're frequently in contact with program officers at, like places like the Gates Foundation. A lot of opportunity to interact with senior leaders at development partners. So like those may or may not develop into research jobs. Like I think that those are more likely to be program officers or type positions or managing a portfolio. But those are possibilities, I think. Yeah, and the path back to academia, it's possible, but like I think that the window, it gets narrower over time because we don't prioritize academic publications. It's kind of on you to make sure that you publish academically when you can, that you develop anything that you might have brought with you from your PhD days. If you do that, then I think that there's an opportunity. If you don't, I think that those opportunities kind of evaporate.
So I think when thinking about outside options, and this would, I think, apply to like any job, even like an academic job, is to think about what is the actual task that you're doing. So as someone with a PhD in economics, like a lot of jobs have some sort of mix of self-directed research, directed research, or teaching. And both jobs within academia and outside of academia have some sort of mix of those things. At the ERS, the work sort of starts out heavily with self-directed research and then sort of progressively gets like more directed research, but continues to have self-directed research, which is great. It's sort of, if you're able to publish those things, your outside options will remain strong. There's also options to go and serve as an economist in other organizations or other agencies within the U.S. government. So there's lots of different sort of ability to shift to different types of work throughout your career. But I think what's most important is to think about the type of work that you're doing and how does that relate to like the types of jobs that you might want to shift to in the future. Not necessarily is this an academic job or is this a non-academic job. That might be controversial to say on a panel about non-academic jobs, but if you think of like academic jobs that are majority teaching and you sort of don't have time to do any research, that might actually limit your outside options more than some of the jobs that are available that are non-academic.
That's actually a great point about the teaching. Yeah.
If I can just add one sentence here, a colleague of mine once told me you get tenure in the profession, not in your job. And so I think that's sort of just mirroring or echoing Jeff's point that, the more you publish, the better your outside options.
Yeah, I thought I have a little bit of a perspective on that. So, when I kind of left academia, went to IFPRI, people described that as a one-way door, that would shut down behind me and I could never come back to academia. I think it's a useful concept. It has to be nuanced a little bit. A lot of people go back to academia after being at IFPRI or after being at ERS. So clearly that one-way door is quite porous. That said, it is still kind of a useful concept because it's not the norm, right? Most people end up staying outside of academia. They don't go back, like Jeff just said and Will just said. If you stay embedded kind of in the academic community, then that door kind of stays open a little bit longer. If you don't, then it shuts down. Definitely, don't think of a job at IFPRI as a obvious stepping stone into a professor job. That's not really what that's not really the most obvious trajectory.
Okay, so I am going to take the last 3 questions and I'm going to mush them into sort of an open question for everybody. And that question consists of 2 parts. One, so this is about like getting a non-academic job. Like, so for all the students who are thinking about applying, and then again, for the students, there are some resources on the website for this panel. So there will be particular resources, particular information about the job openings, about various websites you can check. So we're not going to address that here, but that's on the website. So for you guys, one, like either one of these questions, one, are there particular skills that you guys think you look for in your organization that like when somebody is applying to your organization, they would really want to highlight? And 2, for the sort of earlier PhD students who are not just thinking about like applying, but are really thinking about sort of how to progress with their PhD, are there particular things you would say they ought to do? Internships, blogs, more policy work, working with people at non-academic organizations, et cetera. Are there things you would advise them to think about early in their PhD career? Like if they know this is a thing they're interested in. So either long-term sort of what they should do, or like, here I am, I want to strengthen my CV. Like, what should I highlight that you guys might look for? Agnes, please.
So we tend to hire people who have some developing country experience or some field experience. It just sort of makes us sure that when we send you somewhere, you're not going to be lost and totally clueless. So that said, you can acquire experience on the job, but most people applying to us already have experience.
Yeah, I would add to that. I mean, I think that is something that was important for me in getting my positions. I had done 2 years as a Peace Corps volunteer and 5 years working in the humanitarian and development sector before getting my PhD. So that did definitely help. I'd say other things are project management experience, which is hard to acquire while you're doing your PhD. But I think, as you mentioned, blog posts, showing that you can take academic research and translate it for a policy audience, whether that's through blog posts, evidence briefs, or other things like that, can be very useful. And the last thing I'll mention is French. Particularly if you want to work at USAID or the United Nations. If you have a second language, but particularly French, that can be very useful.
And I can follow up on some of those. I think that one aspect that Mathematica definitely, in a sense, selects on, that they target, but I'm sure other organizations here do too, is demonstrated experience working successfully with teams, and teams really could mean a lot of different things. And so that could be with policymakers, that could be with people from different disciplines. And I think that that's one of those aspects that might not be built directly into a PhD program, but you can actively search out, whether that's doing a consultancy with someone or trying to work with an interdisciplinary center at your university. There are a lot of opportunities there where I think we'll always care about all of the, let's say, the technical and very specific aspects of your work, but to some extent, anyone that makes it to kind of the next round of a process is assumed to have a lot of those skills. And what could very well distinguish you is your ability to really work with other people, and some of that is, as both Agnes and I think Jen have mentioned before, this ability to actually communicate and translate things. And some of that is just based on what experience you have before, and some of it is more on what you kind of go out of your way to do and demonstrate that you have, whether it's a blog post. At one point, I did a kind of a policy communications training that I found to be really useful. That was through the Population Reference Bureau. Anyway, I think there are a lot of things like that only improve your candidacy for Mathematica and the types of organizations that are presented today.
There, folks? Yeah, Samia. Samia, do you want to add? You can add now. This is sort of an open question. Or
okay.
You guys are like talking to one another. Anyone say anything? Go on.
Okay. Just in terms of the CGIAR, one of the big at the institution level, one of the big missions is to build capacity as well. So also to be able to work with national universities in countries that you would be doing field work in, to be able to collaborate and work with people in very different contexts. And so that's a big chunk of what you wouldn't, I mean, you'd have some exposure to that early career where you wouldn't be necessarily leading the engagement, but you should expect to not be surprised if you're on a team where, you know, one of the partners happens to be, you know, if you're working in Ethiopia, it might be a national university there and you would be working with people. And it does two things. One is it helps build capacity, but it also helps for us to bring in context and relevance. And so I think that's something to keep in mind as well. And just to add, for those who are looking towards preparing for such a job who are early career on, I mean, the CG is actually a really good place to, it's very easy for academics to do research with the CGIAR. I mean, the CG is a weird place. It's not academia, but a lot of it functions like traditional academia, including the not so good stuff about academia. So it has some of the same problems. And so in a sense, for those who are interested in that kind of international development work, you know, talking to your advisors, talking to, especially if you're in land-grant universities, talking to advisors, seeing if you can collaborate with folks at IFPRI or folks with us, how could you bring us in order to write a chapter of your dissertation? That's a great way to get some really good experience. Whether you're looking at the CG as a final career or not, it's really, really good experience. So that's something to think about for those who are sort of early on in the process.
I know a couple of people are going to add, we're going to do this for like 4 minutes. We'll stop at 11:10 and then open up to other questions. But one thing that somebody specifically asked me that sort of is in this theme was they were like, there's sometimes these like behavioral sort of questions within interviews that I'm not prepped for. Like I know how to talk about my job market, but like, I don't know how to say what I would do in some specific situation. So if anyone has experience with that sort of like the interview level thing, like when you're doing the official interview, like please do speak to that.
Yeah, so in addition to the things that were mentioned, which are highly valued here at CMI, the other things are grant writing experience. They really value that, the ability to get funding. And then the other thing is interdisciplinary work. So we work with political scientists, anthropologists, sociologists, and the ability to work with others in those fields and be able to communicate effectively is very highly valued here.
Theo, did you want to say something? For Agnes, either one. Yeah, go on. Let's hear
yeah, I agree with, sorry, Agnes, go ahead.
I agree with John about the interdisciplinary work. I think it's not only a matter of being able to talk to them, but also to appreciate what disciplinary perspectives they bring. So I've learned so much, for example, from working with nutritionists that would probably not have happened if I were not in my division, which is the poverty, health, and nutrition division. And likewise, you could learn from biophysical scientists if you were, for example, at EMI or the other CG centers. There's really a lot of opportunities to work with with people from other disciplines.
In terms of the interview, when I was prepping for these both academic and non-academic interviews, I was preparing in a very similar fashion to, of course, talk about my job market paper, but also because everyone, even academic institutions, look for fit. And it's just a different kind of fit. And so for non-academic institutions, the fit that they're looking for is your ability to work in teams, how eager are you to learn different perspectives, like Agnes mentioned, to work in an interdisciplinary space. And the fit that an academic place looks at is slightly different, but it's all about figuring out for that particular institution that you're preparing for an interview, what they focus on and how you see yourself fitting within their space, and answering that fit question, which is slightly different based on whether it's academic or non-academic.
So I can add one thing specific to what Leah raised that I think is consistent with what the speakers are saying now, which is that one important element of fit for Mathematica, and I think many non-academic organizations, is your flexibility. And that's both your flexibility to think on your toes. And so someone might be asking you something that's hypothetical. Someone might be asking you to explain your job market paper or your research from a different lens or what its implications are. Someone might be asking you to switch gears from what you might think of as a risk project to something that is really more in the framework of social protection. And those are very closely related, but people can have very disparate ways of framing those things. So I think an ability to both be flexible in what you work on, but also think flexibly and see how things in a sense connect and transcend is crucial for working. I mean, I think it's also helpful in an academic setting, but I think it's really crucial for this non-academic space we're talking about, especially the policy-centric one. So to the extent that possible, I honestly do believe, I mean, I remember doing this, you can practice those things before you do interviews. You can have people essentially kind of ask you related, but maybe to you somewhat off the ball versions of questions that kind of force you to think about how to connect your main point. And that goes a long way.
Awesome, thanks. Okay, so we're gonna go to some of these questions that you guys have been trying to. I wanna say in advance, I don't think we're gonna get to all of these questions. Also, I'm gonna pick and choose. Some of the questions seemed like they would be best directed to like a very specific person, or they're really specific. So what I'm gonna do is after this panel is done, we're gonna post the video, and I'm going to put a Twitter chat where I just add a whole bunch of these additional questions, and the panelists and other people from Twitter can also jump in. And if you're not on Twitter, you can still access that even if you don't personally have an account. And if you have problems, you can email me specifically. So that's how we're gonna deal with like leftover questions. So the questions that we do go through, I wanna start with one that I think is really, really important to, really honestly should be all development economists or all people who want to have children, but it does tend to be more important to the women, unfortunately. And that is how did you deal with sort of having children, or if you didn't have children, sort of like how do you think your organization does or doesn't support kids with very young children, babies, and sort of ongoingly as your children get older? And that could honestly be anything from like maternal time, paternal time, to like things about schooling later on. Some organizations have schooling related things if you're in different countries. So that's a wide question about having children. Yeah, let's start with Samya, and then go on after that. You guys can sort of jump in.
Yeah, so the CG is really good about that. So I mean, you have great maternity benefits, paid leave, unpaid leave. AAEA pays for the education of 3 children. I think 75% of it is paid for through schooling, so you can really afford to send your children to a really good school if you're posted, particularly. Yeah. And that's true no matter what office of AAEA you are in. Flexible working hours. If you're posted with AAEA is headquartered in Colombo. We have a daycare facility on campus, which is highly subsidized. So kids usually, up to the age of 10, you finish school and the kids go there, and there's great staff there to help kids and keep them entertained till the parents can take them home. Yeah, I mean, we arrange for daycare facilities when there are meetings, especially research meetings on campus. It's really, I mean, I don't have any children, but I have lots of colleagues who started families in the CGIAR and at AAEA, and have been very successful at making progress in their careers while also having young families. The one thing to know as with AAEA particularly, and my guess is this is probably true for other CG centers as well, except maybe IFPRI might be different, and I'll let somebody from IFPRI answer that. If you're hired by AAEA, and I mean you are hired, it doesn't automatically mean your spouse will get to work in the country. So that is something that you would have to figure out for yourself, and that's got to do with the way there's regulation and rules regarding tax status. It's primarily got to do with the fact that CGIAR, at least AAEA salaries, are tax exempt in the country that they're in usually. And so it's not possible for spouses to necessarily get hired under the visa class that you come under. And so that can often be a complication for the lack of a better phrase, the trailing spouse. So, but on other factors, especially if you're female, I think AAEA, and I think in general, the CG does a very good job of being more than an inclusive and fair employer.
Yeah, I agree. I think Soumya is right that a lot of the it tends to be different if you're outposted. So if you're outposted, so you're not based in the US, you tend to have very good relocation and schooling benefits for your children and also home leave benefits. Um, if you're based in the US, you have different challenges because you're based in the US. So people who are on international visas used to be able to bring in nannies, but I think that's become very difficult now with the State Department. We all know what the challenges are in the US these days. Um, Aside from that, though, the work culture is very supportive. It's a flexible time. We have breastfeeding rooms. Um, there's really a culture of mentoring your early career colleagues who have children. As I mentioned earlier, I had two children, one of which is 20 and the other one is 16, both while I was at IFPRI. So yes, it can be done.
Right, briefly do World Bank and then Jen, and then we'll move on and try to keep your answers brief.
So the bank in general is super supportive. We have 5.5 months of parental leave. So it's for the primary caregiver, it's gender neutral, the language. It also applies to adoptions. The bank's insurance policy, I understand, is very generous also when it comes to things like IVF. But more generally, I wanted to make a couple of points because, as we all know, economics has a serious problem with treating women and people of color in a supportive way. When you're on the market, look for wherever, whether it's academic or not, look for young women. Look for young women in the department because that will tell you that the department is likely had to deal with not just write down policies down on paper, but actually deal with the implementation. Look for women at the associate level. That's a sign that they have sort of cleared, whatever the tenure clock considerations were, that there's been sort of an empirical demonstration of what it's like to be a woman with a child. And then finally, just look for cork boards that look like mine. Look for people feeling comfortable enough taking up space in their office, displaying their home life. That's a sign of a supportive environment. For me, I personally breastfed my child until he was 28 months old, which was last month. I was able to juggle my my fieldwork obligations, my travel obligations. And so you really want a supportive environment like that because in 2020, nothing else is acceptable.
The only thing I wanted to say really briefly was, okay, first, US government, not great. They need to get better. Second, the other thing to keep in mind is that a lot of these employers, particularly US government, United Nations, have different hiring classes. So some of the benefits that we've been discussing may apply to certain international staff, but may not apply to other staff classes. So just be aware when you're applying for jobs of those differences.
All right, awesome. Will, did you want to add something to that? You can go ahead if you want.
Yeah, very quickly. So I joined ID Insight when my wife was 6 months pregnant and I had 3 months left in my PhD, and they were unbelievably supportive. I moved to India, I got onboarded, I went back to the US, we had our child. I got a full month of paid non-childbearing spouse leave, even though I was brand new with the organization. So that was great. I mean, ID Insight is a very young organization. I think our median age is probably in the high 20s. Our founders are roughly 40. There's been a baby boom over the past 2 years. I think I was the first to have children. Like now the older people, the folks that are in the, like leadership and senior leaders, like they all have kids now. So, right now there's just a very kind of supportive environment, but I think that like specific policies are on the way. But overall, our operations is very, very understanding, like very promotes work-life balance, is very family-oriented, and I think hopefully as we institutionalize these policies, they'll, I think they'll be positive.
Okay, so another question that I thought was really relevant, and you guys have sort of spoken to a tiny bit already, so we're gonna finish with that, is what is the differences between positions in like the head office in your organizations versus being in a regional office? So if you're IFPRI DC versus IFPRI Ethiopia, or where you are, you're at the head office, Samia, but then like there's clearly other offices where people work for. So maybe let's start with Samia, and then she'll sort of speak to the CJRs, and if anyone outside the CJRs Maybe Will, maybe United, or anyone else wants to speak to that, then great.
Country offices tend to focus on research and policy matters within country or within region. That's typically the way that goes. Head offices tend to sort of do work across the region. So I'm stationed in Colombo, which is where our head office is. So I work across. I work with staff in every regional office on a vast range of issues. It's not hard and fast, but that's typically how that goes. And a lot of it, I think, does matter. I mean, there are similarities across the CG, but there are also some idiosyncratic differences between different institutions. And so, generally, there's a lot of from my sense of it. There's a lot of understanding. There's a lot of communication between head offices and field offices in terms of what's being done, how it's being done, in terms of collaboration, in terms of learning. But yeah, if you were posted in a field office, you should expect to work more on that region. So, for example, our Ethiopia office tends to focus on matters in East Africa, typically, and our Nepal office will focus on matters in the mountains. That's sort of typically the way it works. India is like the European Union, so there's lots of different things going on out there, and they tend to focus mostly on India. But I think that's a similar structure across the CG institutions. And as Agnes rightly said, IFPRI does have the largest number of economists within any CG institution. I think EMI sort of comes a close-ish second. There are quite a few of them. Historically, we had a lot more. Now we have some less, but that keeps changing depending on who leaves and who's retiring and all of that. But we're not the only CG organizations. There are many, many more, and many of them, all of them have economists. So you should keep a watch out for that as well.
I think I might be curious to hear from Ishani, because I like especially with the, what is it called? The young, what's that sort of entrance program within World Bank, young something?
For operations, young professionals.
Yeah.
Right? So the operational.
You could bring that in with the other question.
Sure. So I typed out the answer for my program, which is the Young Economist program, which we recruit for through the AAEAs. And there we're looking for like your academic chops, really. But for the Young Professionals program, you can spend time in the field if you want to. I have a number of friends who joined the bank around the same time as me in the Young Professionals program that are all sort of scattered around the world. And that sort of, for them, that's if you want to become a manager or more senior, I think that's one really good way of doing that. To go from the research department out into country office is a little rarer. It has happened. So for example, my colleague Kathleen Beagle, who a lot of you may know for her work, left the research department a few years back to go to Ghana, and she led the HD program there for a couple of years, and now she's sort of in the management team for the gender. I'm not going to go into the acronym, but that particular wing of the bank. So it's certainly feasible, but the research department itself, as I mentioned in my typed out answer, is really focused in DC.
And I think maybe a broader answer for students that was that it's probably going to be quite organization specific. So if you are applying to an organization and you notice where it is, then just reach out to somebody within the organization, ask them about the difference between the head office, the regional office, sort of how those differ if you want to know about flexibility between the two. So another question that I thought was really pertinent is, with your organizations, how do work visas work for people who are not in the US working in the US, or if you are, any citizen looking to work in a regional office, sort of how does that work? And maybe let's start with Impact, because I'm kind of curious to know how their work visa thing, and it's in DC, and that's sort of that probably stands for a lot of the DC consulting firms, and then anyone else who wants to jump in.
Sure. So I'm on an H-1B. So they at the research economist and above level, they sponsor work visas for anyone who comes in at my level and above that. I don't think they sponsor work visas for the analyst level, but they sponsor it for the economist level and up. Yeah.
Anyone else?
I'll say just quickly, for the United Nations University, obviously the UN is awesome and they can get anybody a visa anywhere, so that's great. For USAID and I guess USDA as well, you have to be a US citizen or possibly a green card holder.
Yeah, my understanding is there's some flexibility if you're like a green card holder and you're in process towards becoming a full US citizen, but unfortunately there's sort of hard restrictions on it for US government jobs.
Samia?
Yeah, for EME and the CG in general, the CG will get those for you. These are generally visas that come under diplomatic class visas for the countries that you're going to be posted in. But like I said, my guess is it's similar for the World Bank, but I'll let Ishani answer that one. But for EME specifically, like I said, the visa class does not allow your spouse to work under that visa class. And we classify dependents, again, going back to the question of family, dependents are spouses and children, either biological or adopted. That's the classification for dependents. And so EME and the CG will take care of that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that your spouse gets to work under that class of visa. But you won't have any trouble getting a visa. That's the long and short of it, and they'll take care of it. So.
Same for IFPRI. You would have a G4 visa if you're not a US citizen or permanent resident. And IFPRI takes care of that.
That's the sort of visa where you're allowed to skip all the long lines, right? Those fancy visas. So another question that a couple people asked about was whether there was sort of a preference for economists trained in either econ departments or ag econ departments, or whether you considered people coming from public policy schools, economists trained in forestry schools and natural resource schools. So we know that there's economists trained for many, many different types of departments in universities all over the world. Is there sort of a preferred economist, or do you feel like your organization is really sort of just considers the person on their merits? Let's start with Estefania.
Yeah, I could say that at Mathematica, there's definitely not, I think, one explicit favorite discipline. And we definitely hire across different types of econ departments, but also certainly hiring, I think, from public policy, perhaps a bit more just based on kind of what our history and relationship was with the field of public policy. But also we hire sociologists and people from other disciplines. So I think from our perspective, it's relatively open, and it's more about skills, fit, things of that sort than it might be at other places.
Yeah, I think it's the same with Impact. We hire pure economists, and that's more in the domestic side. But even there, we hire people from the health, different sort of disciplines in health, and in the international development space, we hire sociologists. We also tend to, I think, hire more economists trained in public policy departments and ag econ departments as well.
I'm going to move on because I feel like this is going to be a similar answer for everybody. And I want to just point out that I think that is a pretty notable difference between academia, where for whatever reason, the type of college that you were trained in tends to have a lot of sticking power to where you can go. So I think that may actually be a real benefit to non-academic research. Another question that I thought was really important and probably applies to a lot of people is, what is the difference if I'm applying to your organization as either a student of having just finished my PhD versus a postdoc? What will that mean for me, and how likely I am to get hired, or does it mean anything about what rank I come in at or anything else like that? Maybe not at IFPRI, because we know IFPRI is hiring that sort of postdoc classes. You'd sort of already point out, Agnes, unless you want to add something, but other folks or IFPRI, whatever.
I don't think there's any difference for how you would apply, but it would make a difference on what the U.S. government's on the GS scale. So it would make a difference by how what level you're on that scale. I think that would be really the main thing for U.S. government jobs in the ERS.
Sorry, Agnes, was there anything particular with that with IFPRI? Because you seem to be saying that first class almost was sort of a kind of a postdoc in and of itself. And you're muted, by the way.
It's the same thing. I mean, the name just changed. So the postdoc is actually the associate research fellow. It's the same thing.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
I would say, we've definitely hired folks that are coming directly, from finishing the program, and others who have, been doing a postdoc. And so it's in a sense, just more a question of candidacy and less of any particular, let's say, level or different path.
Okay, so then that I'm gonna end our questions. If you did give me a question, I almost certainly have it written down. So like I said, I'm gonna put it in a sort of Twitter feed. And if you notice that I didn't get to your question, or if you have another question that comes up later, you can feel free to add to that. And then maybe I would just sort of, I know we're officially out of time, but for those who have like anything that they really want to say that they sort of didn't feel like was asked, that they want to add in as a bonus, like no, you do not have to do that. But if there's something you want to put out there about your organization or non-academic research in general, feel free to add that in this post-panel bonus time.
So I'm going to leave soon, but I'll just end by saying thank you for organizing this. And to the people attending, I'd like to say that you can have a very productive research career outside the academe. And it's been a lot more rewarding than I expected. And as you get up the career ladder, you also have a chance to mentor a lot of junior and early career researchers. And for me at my stage now, that's maybe the most rewarding part of my job. So thanks everyone. I'm going to leave. Bye.
Thank you, Agnes. Anyone? Yeah, Soumya.
I would just say it's there's a lot of and some people already said this. There's a lot of uncertainty in the sort of the world that we operate, even under normal times. Things never go the way you think they do. Things will change a lot from where you started, and there's probably more noise in that system, including in terms of grants that you think come, don't come, things that you think would never happen, do happen. And so I think there's a lot more. The bounds of error are a bit higher, and so you got to get a bit comfortable, just getting your head around it. And things happen in the last minute. You can't necessarily plan 9 months in advance, which maybe you could do a bit more in a university system. So I think that's something to sort of also kind of keep with you. So there's a bit of a personality type to it as well. You have to be more willing to work and operate and make decisions in uncertainty and move with a fair amount of uncertainty. I think that's part of it too, and that's there for some people and not there for others. But really, I really want to thank you for organizing this. I wish I had something like this when I was on the market 10 years ago. It would have really helped me, honestly.
Anyone else? All right, well, I want to thank all of you guys for donating this hour and a half of your time. It's really, really kind of you to do that. Honestly, we had so much interest that we'll probably do this again next year, again, also through AAEA International. Esteban had a brilliant idea that we should have a live Twitter thing going on at the time. So we'll look for grad students to sort of do that at the moment, maybe next time. If you guys have any feedback for me, you'll obviously, give it in whatever format you see appropriate. And for students, feel really free to email me. And again, the website for this that sort of gave all the information I just chatted here. So you can get my information. You can, go see the posted video afterwards, send the posted video around. And I'll post like the Twitter thread that we start at that website too, so that you can add on other questions or see answers to questions that we didn't get to today. All right, thanks everybody very much.
I think we need a round of applause.
Thank you, Leah.
Yeah,
thank you so much for organizing. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Leah.
No, it was really honestly very fun. Thanks everybody. We'll talk to you guys soon, all of you.